You know, as one of those strange people that are just weirdly into maps and globes and topographies and stuff, that's just a pumper-upper video for me. I'm always at the edge of my seat, just kind of, yeah, at the end of it for some reason. Don't judge me, please. Well, guys, I'm so excited to be with you here today. I just want to welcome you again, especially if this is your first time. We especially want to welcome you. We're so glad that you decided to join us. And for those of you that's your first time, I want to stress to you that I'm not the lead pastor here. My name is John Branch, and I'm part of the leadership. I'm part of the communication team here. And I get to come up here every once in a while and talk with you. And for most of you, I haven't got to meet before, so I like to kind of introduce myself a little bit because most of you haven't met. First of all, I don't work here. I'm not on staff here at North Point. I've got a day job. I'm a doctor physician here in the community. I'm married. I've got a really cool smoking hot wife right here, and she's weirdly into unicorns, so that's her thing. And we've been married. It'll be 12 years this year that we've been married, and we've got 3 kids, and we've been going to North Point now for right at 9 years. And during that time, we've gotten to see and do some pretty incredible things. For the last 2 years, actually, my wife has been on staff. She's a groups director in Inside Out, which is our high school environment. And I've gotten to do some cool stuff, too. For about 4 years, I was a small group leader in Inside Out, which is a really neat position to be in because you get to follow a group of guys all the way from 9th grade all the way through graduation and just see how they grow and mature and become just young men. The other thing I get to do is I'm on the stewardship team. So once a month, I get together with a group of people, and there's like CEOs and CFOs a part of this group, and we look over the finances of the church. We look over the budget and the Excel spreadsheets, and we do all the nerd stuff, and just make sure we're making good decisions with the resources that we have here. And then I'm on the teaching team, so occasionally I get to come up here and share with you guys on stage, which I'm really excited to do that today in the series that we're in. And this time of year is actually kind of a cool time to be up here as well. With springtime, everybody getting off spring break, and most people really like this time of year because it's getting warmer and you go outside a little bit more. But this is kind of a difficult time of year for me personally. So every year about this time, I look at the calendar and I see it's late March, and it really it's troublesome to me because I realize that it's still 5 months until college football starts, and it's something I deal with every year when this time comes around. And, especially coming off this last year when we had this huge bowl victory over an SEC school at the end of the year, and we've got to wait all this time, and, this is the best year to come. And I feel like, my blood just, when it gets closer to fall, my blood just starts running a little more orange. Is anybody with me on that? Yeah. All right. I didn't think there'd be that many Clemson fans in the audience, so I'm so thankful for that. What an enlightened crew we've got today. This is going to be a really, really great morning. So, but I'm excited to be with you guys today, especially in this series called Road Trip, because it's been one I've been excited about for a while now. And my wife and I, we've got our 3 kids, and we go on road trips a decent bit with our kids. And there's nothing more relaxing than being stuck in a car for several hours with little kids. And it's just a wonderful time to get to know your kids a little bit more. And our kids, they're very different. So we got 3 kids, their personalities are very different, their interests are very different, but their core passions, what they're passionate about, they really come to the surface when we're in these car trips for long periods of time. And I feel like it's a kind of also universal passion for kids. Their passions are arguing, complaining, and pushing old dad right off the deep end. And they do a really good job of this, and they have just an incredible ability to argue about things. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, he's humming to himself, or he's tapping my seat. And like they get so frustrated at things. And Melissa and I, we spend a lot of time just trying to say, hey, I don't understand why you're so frustrated at this, and you can't see it the way we do. And there was one particular time, here's a picture of our little angels. And so there was one particular trip we took to Florida, and it was to the Florida beaches, and we were in the car for like 14 hours, and it was just 14 hours of joy with these little angels. And so we were so close to the beach. We were like a mile or a mile and a half to the beach, and there's this bridge you have to go over to get there, and we're almost on this bridge, and I can see over this bridge, there's these I can actually see the hotels over there, and my daughter, who's sitting in the seat beside me, the one over on the far side there, don't let the smile deceive you. She's got little horns every once in a while. But for something snapped in her, and she just started screaming and crying. She's like, Dad, I don't care about the beach anymore. Let's turn around. Let's go home. And I'm like, honey, we are right here. We are about a mile and a half away. We can get there. Mommy and Dad can get out, get a drink. We're going to be great. Just trust me. We're almost there. And she wasn't hearing it. She was crying. She was screaming. And, I was just dripping steam coming out. And, that phrase, madder than a dad in traffic, that was me at that moment. But you know, this is really a common thing for us with our kids. There's so many times that with our kids, we just see things a lot differently than our kids. And we spend a lot of time with our children helping them to see things differently, see things the way we see it. And that's just a common thing. You know, when I think about it, there's a lot of times that I struggle with that too. When I look at things in my life, things that I'm struggling with, that I have a tough time seeing things or my situation or the way I see myself differently than I have in the years past or the months past or the weeks coming up to that moment. And I think a lot of us kind of deal with this too. There's areas of our life that we have a tough time really stepping back and looking at it with new eyes. And that's what we're looking at in this series. We're looking at Jesus and his life in different ways. And when we look at Jesus, we look at his life, we look at how he came to earth and he treated people and interacted with people. He had this incredible ability of seeing things that other people didn't see, of seeing people in different ways that they couldn't see themselves. And that's what we're talking about in this series. And we're looking at Jesus in these different ways. And hopefully we'll be able to see ourselves in different ways. And we're looking at some of the earliest and first followers of Jesus today. And this is such an interesting perspective that we're going to see. And when we look at the earliest followers of Jesus, the people that were actually closest to him, that became close personal friends of Jesus, we get a really neat window into what Jesus sees in them and how they are. And there's two things that are abundantly clear when we look at the earliest followers of Jesus. And this is really good news when we look at these two things. They're just completely apparent when we see these. The first thing is being a sinner doesn't disqualify you from following Jesus. You know, having junk in your life and this history and this baggage in your life and things that you've done and things that you've thought about, things you've been a part of, having these things that you wish just weren't part of your narrative doesn't disqualify you from following Jesus. In fact, when we look at the people that were closest to Jesus, it's actually a prerequisite. It's actually a prerequisite for you following Jesus, is having this baggage, having this sin in your life. The other thing that's really apparent, and it's a little less intuitive when we think about it, when we look at the earliest followers, it's really apparent, is difficulty believing doesn't disqualify you from following Jesus. Having these doubts inside of you, these questions about God and Christianity and Jesus, having these questions inside of us that we struggle with doesn't disqualify you from following Jesus. And when we look at his earliest and closest followers, that was true about them at times. And if you haven't heard the last couple weeks of what we've been looking at, and if you haven't listened to the last two sermons, I'd encourage you to go back online and listen to those. And I'm going to bring up a map here because I love me some maps. And so Buck started out with the River Jordan, and we saw it as John the Baptist baptized Jesus. And he painted this picture of how this went down and the scene that this took place. And then after that, last week had Jeremy come up and we talked about Jesus, instead of going straight from this baptism out and starting talking to people, actually went out into the wilderness area where he struggled and he worked through some things that he had to work out, and he didn't take any shortcuts before he had to do what he came to earth to do. And today, what we're going to be talking about is this really incredible scene. And it took place at the Sea of Galilee, which is at the top here. And we got a picture of this place here. And this is an actual place. This is a place you can go and you can see and you can get in this water. And you can actually experience this place that we're talking about today. And we're going to be looking at this scene through the eyes of Luke. And he's the one that wrote the chapters and the verses that we're going to talk about. And he's got a really good way of describing these scenes, and the details that he adds is really kind of neat. So we're going to start here in Luke. So in Luke, he says, one day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, which is the Sea of Galilee, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. And this is such a neat little thing that I just want to camp out on just a second. Is when we think of Christianity, we don't think about this much. But faith in Christianity, in Jesus, when he goes onto these scenes, he's actually teaching people. He's telling people about God. And Christianity, it's a faith that's based on information. And faith begins with information when we're talking about Christianity, because it is based on something that happened. So anything that's based on information, a faith based on information, it requires you to understand, to ask questions. So if you've ever been a part of an organization or a church or religious organization that discourage you from asking real, intelligent, and adult questions, you should probably get away from that organization, because by the nature of Christianity, you should be able to ask these difficult questions to understand it more deeply. Then it goes on to say, it says, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. And this is just kind of setting the scene here. It's kind of a neat scene because I have a picture here of the shore of Galilee, and this is pretty close to where we think this probably happened. And we see in this time period of life, of Jesus, people just started coming out and listening to him teach, whether it's in the synagogues or these random scenes by on the hilltop and stuff like that. But in this scene, like there's we don't know if it's hundreds or thousands of people that are crowding around him on the edge, and he's backing up closer and closer to the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And he's getting closer and closer. And behind him, there's this group of fishermen. There's these fishermen that had finished their day of fishing. They had fished all night, and they were there just washing their nets, and they were just listening him from behind him there. And so he gets closer, and he doesn't have any more room, and he looks, and there's the water, and maybe he's thinking, should I just go ahead and walk out there now? And maybe he's, no, I don't think they're ready for that. So let's see what he did. So he says he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat, which is kind of a neat scene. He's just sitting in this boat with this random fisherman here teaching this big group of people. And then it says when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, who we would see later is the same person as Peter. He asked Simon something. He asked him a simple question, a simple request. It seemed kind of weird to Simon at the time, but it was well within his ability. He didn't look to Simon and say, hey, I want you to leave everything and follow me and do all this stuff. He asked him a very simple request, one little step. And we'll see what he asked him. He said, put into deep water and let down the nets for the catch. And it seems like such an easy request from a fisherman in his boat with the net. But you see, Simon had been working all night. See, fishermen, they worked at night, and then in the day they kind of rested. So they had already been out and done their full day of work, and they were done, and they were back, and they'd already kind of cleaned all the beer cans out of their boat like fishermen do, and they had washed their nets, and they were done for the day. So this was a request that wasn't really very convenient, and it wasn't really a convenient request for Simon. So you feel this pushback. He's like, I've already done all this. You're asking me to start this entire process over again. So I'm going to lose sleep. I'm going to lose a day of work. This is not really very convenient. You can feel this tension in his response. He says, Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night. And this master, that little phrase, it's just like saying sir. It's just a little term of respect. He says we've been out here all night working. We've already done everything. You're asking me to start this entire process over. And not only that, we've worked hard all night, and we haven't caught anything. He's like, Jesus, I don't think you understand. When you fish when the water's cool. The fish come to the surface, and you cast the nets out and catch it then. And so, like, you look out there, and there's no one fishing. Everybody's done fishing. I don't understand why you're asking me to do this. And besides, aren't you a carpenter? What are you doing giving me fishing advice? Peter had no idea what Jesus saw in that moment. He didn't have any idea what hung in the balance of this decision of him to take this one step towards Jesus. All he could see what was in front of him. He was saying, Jesus, I've already done this the right way, and it didn't work out. And you're asking me to do it again? And the request didn't make sense to him. It didn't jive with what Peter saw. And I think a lot of us struggle with this sometimes when we feel this pull from God to do things in our lives. Like in our marriage, maybe we feel this pull in a marriage to really get to know our spouse, to spend extra time getting to know them. And you're just thinking, you don't know who I'm married to. You don't understand the situation we're in. It doesn't make sense what you're asking me to do. It's pointless. Or in our job or with our finance, and you look to God and you feel that pull, and you're just like, God, you don't really see what I see. You don't understand what you're asking me. And this is what Peter, how he was reacting to Jesus in this moment. He said, you don't see what I can see. I don't think this is a good idea. He didn't see what hung in the balance, what hung on the other side of this decision of taking one step towards Jesus. How it would change his life forever. How would it affect the people around him? How he would go on to found the church. How that would affect the lives of billions of people after him, including us sitting here today 2,000 years later talking about it. He had no idea that in 1,500 years this building would be built. And some of you know what this building is. We have a picture of the inside here. This is St. Peter's Basilica. And I've actually been to this place. This is in Rome. And this bears the name of the same fisherman that we're talking about right here. And when I went there, I was 23 years old, and it was the summer after my first year of medical school, and that's like the last summer of my life that I actually get a couple months off. So I got to, for a couple months of that summer, for about 6 weeks, I spent doing a research project where I'd have to get in this cage with a pig and take pictures of this wound healing. It was really super nerdy and uncomfortable for me because I was around a pig for a long period of time. But I got this amount of money. I spent the whole bit going to Europe with a buddy of mine, and we spent a couple weeks just kind of touring around Europe, and we would sleep on the train, and then we would get we would sleep in these really shady hostels for $10 a night. But we ended up at this place right here, St. Peter's Basilica. And we were tired and dirty. We walked into this place, and you walk in, and everybody has the same reaction. This picture does no justice to it. You walk in, and you're just amazed. It's an incredible feat of architecture, even by today's standard, but this was built over 120 years and starting in 1502. Peter had no idea what hung in the balance here. And this building is beautiful, but he had no idea the implications of what's associated as the church. From what happened from one step in decision, him following Jesus, the domino effect of how it affected the rest of his life in the founding of the church and the lives of billions of people after him would go on to understand the healing and love in the relationship with Jesus Christ because of his efforts. He could have lived and died a first century fisherman, never to be heard of again. He could have easily said no in this moment. He had no idea what Jesus saw for his life. But his reaction, the way he responded, changed everything. It says here in the verse, "But because you say so," Jesus, not because I believe you, because Peter, knowing full well there would be no fish, Jesus, knowing full well there would be fish, but the fish were completely irrelevant, that they paled in comparison what was to come afterwards. But because you say so, it didn't start with belief, it started with one step in trust. But because you say so, I will lay down the nets. And it goes on to say, when they had done so, and not when they thought it was a good idea, that they might get around to it at some point. It's when their actions intersected with the faithfulness of Jesus when everything changed for them. And we see this incredible scene of what's happening. This is such a turning point in the life of Peter, in the lives of the people around him, in the life of the world. We see what happened. He says, when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. With nobody's out there fishing. There is no fish out here. Then it goes on to say, so they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. Can you imagine this scene? That Peter's here getting these nets in, and the fish are filling the boat. The boats are beginning to sink. He calls his buddies over and said, can you believe this? What's going on? I've never seen anything like this. This defies every bit of logic that I've had. And he keeps pulling this in. The boats began to sink, and there's at some point in this process, something snaps inside of Peter, and he realizes that he is in the presence of someone so much greater than he thought. He looks from the fish up to Jesus. And he realized there's something different about this man. And in this moment, in this realization that he's in the presence of something so much greater than he's ever been in the presence of, his reaction, what is his reaction? Can you imagine his reaction? What does he do as this boat is about to sink and he's in the presence of this Jewish carpenter? His reaction is very, very interesting. Here's his reaction. He says, when Simon Peter saw this, he cried out, "We're rich. We won't have to work for weeks." And he goes on to say, Peter offered Jesus a 7-year contract, 30% ownership of the company, with a 7-year non-compete upon termination of the contract by either party. And when I read this verse, I was just like, man, that 7-year non-compete is brutal. Well, we know that's why you should read your Bible, so I can't pull one of these over on you. But that wasn't Peter's reaction. Can you imagine what Peter's reaction was in this moment? What would your reaction would have been? We see in the next verse, it says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees. The only thing that he could think to do was fall at Jesus' knees. And he said, this is such an important moment in Peter's life. Can you imagine what would he say to somebody that just performed a miracle in front of him? And this is really, really interesting what he says right here. He says, "Go away from me, Lord. Why would he say that? Why would he say in this moment of being in the presence of Jesus, why would he say, go away from me, Lord? What an interesting response he had. And we see why he said it in the next sentence. He says, I'm a sinful man. Peter looks at Jesus and he says, I could reach out, I could touch your feet right now. I am face to face with you, but if you knew me, if you knew what I have done, you knew what I've been through, the things that I've done in my mind, you should be nowhere close to me. I don't know who you are. I know you must be from God. And because you're from God, you don't need to be anywhere close to me. I don't belong anywhere close to you. Why would he say that? It's because the church, for generations and generations, had told people that God wanted nothing to do with people with sin in their life. That people that had sin and history and baggage in their life belonged nowhere near church or religious leaders or God. And Jesus, looking at Peter, says, no, you belong right here. I belong right here with you. I know everything about you. Jesus came to earth to establish something that was brand new. And we see this throughout Jesus' life, the way he looks at Peter, the way he looks at everybody he comes into interaction with that just has junk in their life, that has sin in their life, that has things that they wish weren't a part of their life. He says, you belong with me. You belong here with me. I belong here with you. And that is exactly what the church should be like. That's why I said before, having sin in your life doesn't disqualify you from God. It's a prerequisite. And that's why we say here, you can belong here way before you can believe. I don't want you ever to think, because of the things you've done in your past or the thing in your life, that you don't belong here and you don't belong with God. And then Jesus' response to him, he says, we see this, then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. He's looking so kindly and patiently to Peter, said, oh, Peter, if you only knew what I knew, you have no reason to be afraid with me. And he says, from now on, and this is where I bet Jesus had a big grin on his face, looking down at Peter, looking down at his friends there, just thinking, oh, you guys have no idea what's to come. This is nothing compared to what you're going to see. He says, from now on, you will fish for people. He's saying, guys, I've come to change the world, and I want you to be there with me. You're going to have a front row seat to some of the most amazing things that's ever happened on this planet. And then we see what happened next. He said, at that point, so they pulled their boats up on the shore, and they left everything and followed him. And we go on to see that they did leave everything. They left the boat, they left the net, they left the very fish that they had just caught to follow this Jewish fisherman. To follow this Jewish carpenter. They would go on to see some of the most incredible thing that's ever happened on this planet. They would become close personal friends with the Son of God. They would go on to see their friend Jesus die on a cross before their very eyes. Many of those people would die very similar deaths to Jesus. And they would die with nothing, with no money, with no position. But you can better believe they didn't die with any regret either for the decision they made to step out and follow Jesus. What an incredible, incredible moment. And there's some of you out there that you listen to this and you listen to this story and you're saying, you know, John, I think that's what it would take for me to follow Jesus now. It's some sort of miracle. If he pulled a bunch of fish out of nowhere or some sort of miracle, I think that's what it would take for me right now to follow Jesus. And I think if Peter were here right now and he would hear this argument, this tension inside you, I think he would look at you and say, what? Seriously? He did a fish trick for me and I followed. Do you know what he did for you? He said, don't you see that this thing, the pulling the fish out, even the healings, everything he did here was pointing to something so much greater, so much more important, so much more incredible. Don't you understand? The thing he did for me was irrelevant. It all pointed towards something else. The reason Jesus came to earth to begin with. Don't you know what he did for you? He would say, you should. I dictated a letter to you about it. And then we can see from Peter's eyes what Jesus came to earth to do. And we can read this in 1 Peter. It says, when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. He says, have you ever been to a crucifixion, do you understand what happens to people when they're up there suffering? The venom that they start to scream at the people around them. He says, when he suffered, he made no threats. He said, I looked up at Jesus, and he was just there so placidly, like he meant to be there, like he was supposed to be there. Peter was saying, I didn't understand. I was so filled with confusion and anger and fear. I looked up at my friend Jesus, who I had seen control nature with so much power inside of him, just standing there, just staying there, doing nothing. And I wanted to scream at him, Jesus, do something. I think Peter would say, I didn't see what Jesus saw. As Jesus hung on the cross, looking down at the world, he would think to Peter, Peter, I am. I'm doing exactly what this world needs right now. I think Peter would say, I didn't see what Jesus saw, but I would. I soon would. It goes on to say, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Peter went on to say, let's go to the next verse. He said he bore our sins in his body on a cross. That's what he came to earth to do. Why did he do this? So that we might die to our sins, and not just die to our sins, but we might live for righteousness. Peter would say, I didn't see what Jesus saw. I didn't see what Jesus had for my life, for my future. And I think a lot of us are the same. We don't see what Jesus sees for us, his plans for us. My question for you today is, what do you have a hard time seeing in your life? What pull do you feel from God in your life? In what area of your life where you just feel like it doesn't make sense? And you would look to God and say, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't be asking me this. This just doesn't make sense. You know, when Melissa and we first started coming here, we felt that pull from God. And this was back, we had 3 kids, 4 and under at the time. Great decision. But we felt all kinds of strain. And I was just starting a practice. We had financial strain. We had emotional strain. We had all kinds of time restraints. But we felt the pull from God to give both of our time and our finances here to North Point. And I had so many things that I had rationalizations of why it was not a good idea. And God, if you saw this is not the best time, I could be doing so much else with this, and I have so much more things I need to do. But finally, Melissa and I came together and says, I don't know if it's a great idea, but because you say so. About 3 years ago, about 3.5 years ago, Buck asked Melissa and I to come up to this room right here. This is back when we were still in Parkside. We were still portable. And none of this was here, the lights, the chairs. This stage wasn't even here. And we've got a picture of that. This table was about right here. And he sat us down at this table. And we didn't know why we were up here. But he started bringing out person after person that sat across from us and told their story. We heard a story of a student, a teenager, that had considered taking their lives. And then they found a group here at this church where they began to see themselves the way God sees them. And they found healing. We listened to the story of a family, of a marriage that was on its last legs, that they thought was over. And they found an environment, they found a fellowship here, and they began to look at each other the way God sees them. And we heard story after story of healing. People experienced the love and grace of God. And that we could be such a small part of that story. Do you think for a second that we regretted 1 minute or $1 that we invested here? That pull from God, do we regret that one step that we took towards God? We began to see those steps the way God saw them. What is God calling you to do? In your marriage, is God calling you to maybe get to know your spouse more, maybe go to counseling? And you look at God and you said, God, you don't see what I can see. This is pointless. And God would say, I wish you could see what I could see. Trust me. Take a step towards me. Maybe it's with your job, and you say, God, I know this job is going to take me away from my kids and my family, but it's going to provide so much more financial security. You just don't understand. You don't see what I see. Maybe it's God whispering to you, say, hey, just trust me. If you could only see the way I see. Maybe it's in your finance, finally trusting God with your finances. For some of you, maybe it's an addiction. Maybe some of you have an addiction that you've been dealing with, and you say, God, I've been in this quicksand for too long. There is no hope for me. And God would look to you and say, oh, I wish you could see what I could see. Take a step towards me. For some of you, it's just God. For some of you, you've had things that happened in your life happen to you that's so horrible, that you've been burned so bad, that you've been holding the grace and healing of God's love for you at a distance for far too long. And you would say to God, God, if you only knew what I've been through. And God would say, oh, I've seen it. But if you could only see what I see, take a step towards me. My question for you, what I really want you to wrestle with is, what is your next step? What is it God's calling you to do? What is it you're struggling to see the way God sees? Because my hope is that you have the courage to take that step towards Him. And eventually you'll be able to see you the way God sees you. You can see your life the way God sees it. You can see your marriage, your relationships, your job the way God sees it. So that's my hope and my prayer for you. Let me go ahead and close this in prayer. God, we thank you. We thank you for your grace. Thank you for your Son. I pray for myself and the people around me now that you would open our eyes so we can see you the way you see us. That we can see the world the way you see it, that we can see people the way you see them, and that we can see our lives the way you see it, God. We ask you to open our eyes, and we ask you to give us the courage to take that next step towards you. In your name we pray, amen. You guys have a great week.